everything that he's worked for as king, all of it is invested in Cleopatra and making sure that she comes to power in a secure Egypt.
At this point in time, Egypt was filled with natural resources and precious materials.
1. Ancient Egyptian tooth care. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to experiment with oral hygiene, long before modern-day toothbrushes or toothpaste. They used a unique mixture of ground-up bull hooves, ashes, and eggshells to make a paste that could clean teeth. But this method had its drawbacks. Gum bleeding was a common side effect. Additionally, Egyptians used other natural ingredients like rock salt, pepper, and iris flowers to help maintain their oral health. They even created early versions of the toothbrush, using twigs from trees to clean their teeth. Interestingly, they also made mint candles to freshen their breath. This early attention to oral hygiene shows that the ancient Egyptians were far ahead of their time in understanding the importance of dental care. What's even more fascinating is that these practices laid the groundwork for some of the dental techniques that are still in use today. 2. Baboons as police officers. In one of the more unusual practices of ancient Egypt, baboons were trained as part of the Egyptian police force. These highly intelligent animals were held in high regard and were often put to work to catch criminals. The Egyptians kept baboons on leashes, and when a crime was detected, they would release them to help capture wrongdoers. In addition to their law enforcement duties, baboons were also trained to assist with everyday tasks like collecting fruit, brewing beer, and performing in dance rituals. They were seen as symbols of power and wisdom, often associated with the god Thoth, the god of knowledge and order. The use of baboons in Egyptian society was not just for their practical applications, but also for their spiritual significance. They were thought to have divine powers, and were often depicted in artwork, including tattoos found on mummies, further cementing their place in Egyptian culture. 3. Crocodile worship and mummification. The crocodile, often feared as a dangerous predator, was actually revered in ancient Egyptian culture, symbolizing both power and divine protection. Crocodiles were associated with Sobek, the god of the Nile, who was believed to have control over water and fertility. This association made crocodiles sacred creatures, leading to practices like their mummification and sacrificial offerings. The ancient Egyptians believed that crocodiles had regenerative powers, and their sacrifice was seen as an act of devotion to the gods. Mummified crocodiles have been found in tombs and temples, sometimes without the use of resin, which was usually used to preserve human bodies. These crocodiles were not just preserved for religious rituals, but also as a symbolic gesture for the afterlife. The Egyptians saw these creatures as powerful guardians, representing the strength of the Nile and its connection to their survival and prosperity. 4. Moldy bread as medicine. The ancient Egyptians were not only skilled in medicine, but also surprisingly innovative in their use of natural remedies. One of their more unusual medical practices involved the use of moldy bread to treat wounds. Though it may sound strange today, this technique worked due to the properties of mold, which produces penicillin-like substances capable of killing bacteria. This early form of antibiotic treatment was used to prevent infection in cuts and wounds, long before the discovery of modern antibiotics. The practice laid the foundation for later medical advancements. In addition to moldy bread, Egyptians also used honey and various herbs to treat wounds and illnesses. The use of these natural substances shows how the Egyptians combined their knowledge of the environment with their medical practices, leading to effective treatments that stood the test of time. What may have been perceived as primitive medicine was, in fact, incredibly advanced for its time. 5. Female pharaohs and fake beards. In a time when Egypt was ruled by men, one bold female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, defied tradition and wore a fake beard to assert her power. Female rulers were rare in ancient Egypt, and those who did rule were often seen as less legitimate than their male counterparts. To combat this perception, Hatshepsut adopted the traditional attire of male pharaohs, including the iconic beard, which was a symbol of authority. She wore it during her reign, and even had artistic depictions of her with the beard, cementing her place as a powerful leader. Hatshepsut's reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and grand building projects, including the construction of her famous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Despite the resistance she faced as a female ruler, Hatshepsut successfully ruled Egypt for over 2 decades, showing that gender was no barrier to her authority. 6. Mice bone pouches for children's health. In one of the more bizarre practices of ancient Egypt, infants were often given protective talismans made from the bones of mice. These pouches, filled with mouse bones, were tied around a child's neck with the belief that they would protect the child from illness and evil spirits. This practice may sound strange today, but it was thought to bring blessings and healing. The bones of mice were considered to have magical properties, likely associated with the mouse's perceived fertility and connection to the natural world. While this was a common practice among the lower classes, wealthier Egyptians often used more elaborate amulets and charms to protect their children. This use of talismans for protection reflects the Egyptians' deep belief in the power of the supernatural and their devotion to keeping harmful forces at bay. It also highlights their resourcefulness in using the natural world to safeguard their loved ones. 7. Shaving eyebrows to mourn cats. Cats were incredibly sacred to the ancient Egyptians, and the death of a beloved cat was met with profound mourning. To express their grief, Egyptians would shave their eyebrows as a sign of respect and sorrow. This practice was widespread, as cats were not only seen as pets, but also as protectors, linked to the goddess Bastet, who represented home, fertility, and protection. When a cat passed away, the family would often go into mourning for several days, sometimes even longer, depending on the cat's role within the household. The act of shaving eyebrows symbolized the deep connection the Egyptians had with their cats, as they saw these animals as part of the family. This tradition shows just how important cats were in ancient Egyptian society, both as symbols of divine protection and as beloved companions, making their loss a moment of significant emotional impact. 8. Cleopatra's sour milk baths. Cleopatra, the legendary queen of Egypt, is famous for her beauty, and much of it is said to be attributed to her unique beauty regimen. One of her most famous practices was bathing in sour donkey milk. The lactic acid in the milk helped exfoliate her skin, removing dead skin cells and promoting the growth of new, fresh skin. Cleopatra reportedly used up to 7,000 donkeys to supply enough milk for her daily baths. While this may seem extreme, the use of milk as a skin treatment is still common today in the form of lactic acid treatments. Cleopatra's dedication to maintaining her beauty was not just about vanity. It was also a reflection of her royal status. 9. Canopic jars for preserving organs. Canopic jars were an essential part of the ancient Egyptian mummification process, used to preserve the internal organs of the deceased for the afterlife. The heart was often removed separately and stored in a special container because it was believed to be the seat of a person's soul. The other organs, lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines, were stored in 4 distinct canopic jars, each representing a different god. These jars were intricately designed and often depicted the gods that protected the organs: Hapi, Duamutef, Imseti, and Kebe-Senuef. The use of these jars was part of the Egyptians' elaborate mummification process, which was intended to ensure that the deceased would be able to live on in the afterlife. 10. King Pepi II's record-breaking rule. King Pepi II, one of the longest-reigning pharaohs in Egyptian history, is believed to have ruled for up to 90 years. His reign began when he was just 6 years old and continued for an impressive duration, though some scholars debate the actual length of his rule. Modern Egyptologists suggest that Pepi II may have ruled for around 64 years, but even this would still make him one of the longest-reigning monarchs in recorded history. During his rule, Egypt experienced relative stability and peace, although some historical records suggest that his reign may have been marred by internal strife later on. 11. The surprising role of tattoos. Tattoos in ancient Egypt were not just decorative, they were symbols of protection, spirituality, and status. Although tattoos are often associated with modern cultures, the Egyptians were some of the first to use them for both aesthetic and functional purposes. Archaeological discoveries of tattooed mummies, particularly from the 11th dynasty, reveal that tattoos were commonly placed on the chest, abdomen, and thighs. These tattoos often depicted deities, protective symbols, and other motifs related to fertility, health, and the afterlife. In particular, tattoos were associated with women, especially those who were pregnant or preparing for childbirth, as they were believed to offer protection during this vulnerable time. The process of tattooing in ancient Egypt was a ritualistic event, with tattoos being applied using a flat brush and soot, and the use of herbs and oils to aid in the healing process. 12th. Sacred pharaoh hairstyles. In ancient Egypt, the hairstyle of the pharaoh was considered a sacred element of their divine status. The pharaoh's hair was never to be seen by the public, symbolizing their connection to the gods. Pharaohs wore special headgear known as the nemez, a striped crown that covered their heads, often adorned with the image of a cobra to signify their authority and divine rule. The idea was that the pharaoh was not just a ruler of the land, but a living god, and their headgear and hair played a critical role in demonstrating that divine right. These crowns and the pharaoh's appearance were meticulously maintained to emphasize their status. Commoners, in contrast, were not permitted to wear such elaborate head coverings, which further separated the social classes. 13th. King Tut's sandals with faces of enemies. King Tutankhamun, known for his opulent tomb and rich artifacts, had a rather unique and symbolic fashion choice: sandals adorned with the faces of his enemies. These sandals were crafted with the faces of both African and Asian captives drawn on their soles, symbolizing King Tut's victory over his foes. This wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a powerful symbolic gesture. Every step King Tut took would be a literal stepping on the faces of his enemies, showing his dominance and the subjugation of those who threatened his reign. This practice was common in Egyptian culture, as pharaohs often wore footwear that depicted their enemies, a way to reinforce their power and divine protection. King Tut's sandals were not just a practical item, but a political and spiritual statement. 14. Hieroglyphs and the missing vowels. Egyptian hieroglyphs are one of the most iconic writing systems in the world, but they also pose a unique challenge for modern scholars. One of the most puzzling aspects of hieroglyphs is their lack of vowels. The system, which combined pictorial symbols and phonetic sounds, was made up primarily of consonants, and the vowels were never explicitly written. This has left scholars with the daunting task of reconstructing how ancient Egyptians actually pronounced their language. While some evidence suggests that certain vowel sounds were sometimes implied, the absence of clear vowels means we can never be entirely sure of the exact pronunciation of Egyptian words. 15. Sacred scarab beetles. The scarab beetle, small and seemingly insignificant, held great spiritual significance for the ancient Egyptians. The scarab was viewed as a symbol of rebirth and regeneration, with its behavior: rolling balls of dung across the ground, symbolizing the journey of the sun across the sky. This connection to the sun god Ra, who was believed to roll the sun across the heavens, made the scarab an important symbol of life, death, and rebirth. The scarab beetle's role in Egyptian culture extended beyond symbolism. It was often used in jewelry, amulets, and tomb artifacts as a protective charm for the deceased. Scarab-shaped seals were used to mark important documents and as offerings to the gods. The scarab was believed to provide spiritual protection and to guide the soul in the afterlife. 16. Bread and beer as currency. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer were considered so valuable that they functioned as currency in many aspects of daily life. These two staples were not only essential for the diet, but also held economic importance. Laborers who worked on the pyramids or in other large state projects were often paid in bread and beer. Beer, in particular, was seen as a sacred gift from the gods, especially the goddess Hathor, who was associated with both fertility and beer brewing. The Egyptians even used beer as an offering to their gods and the deceased, with both bread and beer frequently appearing in tombs as part of the burial goods. Bread was seen as the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet, while beer was used in religious rituals and as a drink of choice for the common people. 17. Toilets in tombs, a sign of respect. The ancient Egyptians were known for their elaborate burial practices, ensuring that the deceased had everything they needed for the afterlife. This included the incorporation of toilets in their tombs. The belief was that the dead would need the same comforts as they had in life, including the ability to relieve themselves. This practice, though unusual to us today, reflects the Egyptians' commitment to respecting the dead and preparing them for the journey to the afterlife. Toilets were often placed in tombs as a sign of reverence, as the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was a continuation of life on earth. Providing for the deceased in this way ensured that they would be comfortable and would have everything they needed in the afterlife. 18. Fly swatters made from giraffe tails. In ancient Egypt, even the task of swatting flies was taken to an extravagant level. The Egyptians crafted fly swatters from giraffe tails, which were both practical and symbolic. Giraffes, with their long, graceful necks and unique appearance, were considered elegant animals. Using their tails to make fly swatters demonstrated the Egyptians' appreciation for both functionality and beauty in everyday items. The tails were used to swat away flies and other insects that plagued the Egyptians, particularly in the hot, dry desert climate. But the use of giraffe tails went beyond mere utility. It was a statement of status. The Egyptians often used materials that were rare or exotic, making even the most mundane tools luxurious and symbolic of wealth. 19. Unusual pets. More than just cats. The ancient Egyptians are well known for their love of cats, but they had an even wider range of pets that were both unusual and sacred. Baboons, hawks, gazelles, lions, monkeys, and even crocodiles were kept as pets, symbolizing power, protection, and divine favor. Hawks were particularly revered for their hunting prowess, while baboons were considered highly intelligent and were even trained to help with law enforcement. The Egyptians also kept domesticated dogs, but unlike modern-day pets, these dogs were often used for hunting, guarding, and even as spiritual protectors. Monkeys were considered playful companions, often depicted in Egyptian artwork. These animals were not just pets, but were symbolic of the natural world's power, with many associated with Egyptian gods. The tears of Isis and the flooding of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians believed that the annual flooding of the Nile River, which was crucial for their agricultural prosperity, was caused by the tears of the goddess Isis. According to Egyptian mythology, Isis wept for her slain husband Osiris, and her mourning caused the Nile to overflow. This annual flooding was vital for enriching the soil, ensuring crops grew and the kingdom prospered. The Egyptians celebrated this event with a special festival known as the Night of Tears, where they would float down the Nile in colorful boats, singing hymns, offering sacrifices, and praying to the gods. The belief in the tears of Isis not only highlighted the importance of the Nile to the Egyptian way of life, but also symbolized the cyclical nature of life and death. 21. Loincloths as protection and fertility symbols. In ancient Egypt, loincloths weren't just practical garments. They held cultural and spiritual significance. Worn primarily by men, especially in the lower classes, these garments were believed to provide protection against illnesses, bad spirits, and the intense heat of the desert. But loincloths were also associated with fertility and sexual vitality, as many were dyed in vibrant colors to symbolize virility and procreation. Some historians suggest that the colors and designs of loincloths were meant to attract fertility and ensure a healthy family. The loincloths also served a defensive purpose, shielding the wearer from the sun's harsh rays and the risks of tropical diseases. The act of wearing a loincloth was as much about protection and survival as it was about the ritualistic expression of manhood and life. 22nd. Mummification. Wrapping the dead in kilometers of cloth. Mummification was one of the most intricate and sacred practices in ancient Egypt, performed with meticulous care to ensure the deceased's safe passage into the afterlife. The process involved wrapping the body in over 1.5 kilometers of cloth, a task that could take up to 70 days to complete. This was not just an embalming technique, but a spiritual ritual, intended to preserve the body for eternity. The wealthier individuals who could afford such an elaborate procedure were wrapped in fine linen, while the lower classes often received simpler versions. The mummification process also involved the removal of internal organs, which were stored in canopic jars, and the body was carefully embalmed with natron, a salt that dried out the flesh. The Egyptians believed that the preservation of the body was crucial for the soul's journey in the afterlife, and this elaborate method was intended to ensure immortality for the deceased. 23. Incest in royal families. One of the most controversial practices in ancient Egypt was the marriage of siblings within the royal family. This was done to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline and to ensure that the power and authority of the pharaoh remained within the family. Cleopatra, the most famous of Egypt's queens, married both of her brothers at different points in her life, as was customary among the ruling elite. While royal incest was common in ancient Egyptian dynasties, it was believed to preserve the divine nature of the royal family. This practice was deeply rooted in Egyptian religious beliefs, which held that the pharaohs were divine beings, descended from the gods, and therefore above the concerns of ordinary human relationships. 24. Replicas of servants. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was viewed as a continuation of earthly life, and the deceased pharaohs were expected to have everything they needed in the next world, including helpers. This belief led to the creation of ushabti figurines, small statues that represented servants, attendants, and laborers. These replicas were placed in the tombs of the deceased to perform tasks that the pharaoh would not want to do in the afterlife. These figurines, often mummified, were thought to magically come to life and serve their master in the afterlife. The ushabti were usually made of wood, stone, or clay, and were often inscribed with spells to ensure they would carry out their duties. Over time, the number of ushabti figurines grew, with some tombs containing hundreds of these figures. 25th. Honey-coated servants for King Pepi II. King Pepi II, one of the longest-reigning pharaohs of Egypt, was known for his extreme and eccentric demands. One of the most bizarre requests he made was for his servants to be covered in honey to distract flies. The king's strong aversion to insects, especially flies, led him to make this unusual demand, as he believed that the honey would attract the flies away from him. His servants were covered in honey while they performed their duties, ensuring that Pepi II could avoid the pests. This odd request reflects the pharaoh's absolute power and the lengths to which he would go to ensure his comfort. Despite the bizarre nature of the demand, it demonstrates the Egyptian belief that the king was a divine being, above the concerns of mere mortals. From the sacred rituals surrounding cats to the extravagant demands of pharaohs, ancient Egypt was a civilization full of fascinating and bizarre practices. These customs, though strange to us today, reflect the Egyptians' deep reverence for the divine, their belief in the afterlife, and their ingenuity in everyday life. What other mysteries do you think are hidden in the sands of time? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more intriguing stories from history.